Looking back and reflecting on my electrician apprenticeship, I'm not afraid to admit that I've made plenty of mistakes. The reality is that as you're learning the electrical trade, or really any trade for that matter, you're going to make mistakes. Of course, the severity of your mistakes will vary throughout your apprenticeship, but the important thing is that you own up to them when you make them, and ultimately that you learn from them. Now, my goal with this video, knowing full well that I'll probably get blasted in the comment section for making myself look like an idiot by admitting to these mistakes, is to hopefully allow some of you guys to learn from these mistakes without having to make them yourself. And to be honest, even as I'm filming this video, I'm still not 100% sure that I want to post this. And real quick, I want to give a huge shout out to Visor for sponsoring today's video. If I go through with posting this, I'll tell you more about them a little later. All right, so I'm gonna start off by telling you about something that I did, or maybe I should say something that I didn't do that was really dumb. Like, D-U-M, dumb. So my foreman and I had been working on a very involved and really pretty decent sized project together when at the tail end of this project, he ended up getting pretty sick and needed to take a couple of weeks off work. What's hilarious about this, but really was not funny at all during the time, is the fact that about halfway through this project, I told my wife that one of my biggest fears was that something would end up happening and I would have to be the one to finish out this project all by myself. And guess what happened? Now, I wasn't truly by myself because my general foreman was still on site to ultimately help guide me and answer any questions that I had along the way, but I was the one that was installing everything and completing the to-do list that my foreman left for me before he went home sick. During that couple of weeks, while I did have some questions here and there, I was feeling pretty good because I managed to work my way through the entire list that he left for me, really except for just one thing. You see, one of the items on the to-do list was to verify that we had power to the equipment that we were going to be turning on at the end of the project. The power was derived from a transformer that we installed, which fed a fused disconnect that ultimately ended up powering the equipment. Now, me being an overly optimistic apprentice and really just being plain naive, I didn't really see the importance of verifying power to the equipment because I had already verified that we had power at the disconnect. And so I just assumed, hey, once we pop these fuses in place and turn on the disconnect, of course we're gonna have power to the equipment. Why wouldn't we? So when the day came that it was time to turn on this equipment, my general foreman asked me if I had finished the list that my foreman left for me and if I was ready to turn this on. And I said, yeah, definitely. I completely finished the list that was left for me and I am ready to turn this equipment on. Except I haven't put the fuses in yet, so let me grab those as we walk over to turn on the disconnect. I'll pop them in and then we can turn it on, and at that time we can verify together that we have power to the equipment. He was definitely surprised that I hadn't put the fuses in the disconnect yet and that I hadn't already verified power to this equipment before the day came that we really needed to turn this on. So he grabbed his shoe brews and I put on my Lamborghinis and we walked over to the disconnect together with the fuses in hand so that way we could pop them in and energize the equipment. I remember feeling pretty good as we were walking over there until we finally made it and opened up the disconnect together, and my general foreman noticed something that made my stomach just completely sink. You see, I completely installed this disconnect by myself, but somehow when I was installing it, I failed to notice that it was missing something very important. As we were going to put the fuses into the disconnect, we noticed that 2 of the 3 phases were completely missing the fuse holders, the pieces that actually hold the fuse to the disconnect in the disconnect. They just were not there. Now, this was definitely kind of a fluke thing because the disconnect should have come from the factory with all of the internal components that it needed to hold the fuses and ultimately be able to operate as it should. Now, don't misunderstand what I'm saying. They didn't send us an unfused disconnect. They sent us the correct one. It's just that from the factory, whoever was assembling this messed up and forgot to put the fuse holders on 2 of the 3 phases. Not only should I have noticed this when I installed the disconnect in the first place, but had I done what my foreman asked me and verified power to the equipment beforehand, I would have immediately noticed when I went to put the fuses in the disconnect to turn it on that there was no way for this disconnect to accept the fuses because the fuse holders were missing. My negligence put us in a situation where we needed to turn on that equipment that day, but we had no way of doing that without going through the whole ordeal of ordering a new disconnect, waiting for it to show up, demoing out the old one, and then installing the new one. And had I just done what I was asked to, I would have noticed this well before it was time to turn on the equipment, and we would have had plenty of time to swap out the disconnect without it being any sort of big deal. Now, thankfully something ended up happening where the date to turn on and commission this piece of equipment ended up getting pushed back, and we were able to find a replacement disconnect almost right away, and it was able to be shipped out to the job site the next day for me to install. So while this story ended up having kind of a happy ending, this was still a massive failure on my part, and I can't tell you how terrible it felt to make such a stupid mistake that could have been easily avoided had I just done what was asked of me. Something that I learned from this, and something that I hope you'll learn from this, is to never make the assumption that things will always work out the way that they should. Test everything, don't take shortcuts, and if you see something that doesn't look right, say something. I found that this trade, and really just life in general, is a lot less stressful if you always strive to do what you know is right and always strive to be blameless. The second mistake I want to tell you about is a time that I got bit by 120. This was a few years into my apprenticeship, and I was opening up a J-box that was up in the ceiling to tie something in to an existing circuit. Of course, and as always, the circuit that I was working on was off, locked out, and tagged out. As I opened up the box to find the circuit that I needed to tie into, a wire nut fell off of the hot from another circuit that was in the same box. Unfortunately for me, this other circuit was energized, and when this wire nut fell off, my hand came into contact with it and I ended up getting shocked. Thankfully, I didn't get hung up and I was able to pull my hand away immediately. Our company's policy is that we wear PPE 100% of the time. So thankfully, I did have my gloves on, which probably reduced the severity of the shock. So here's some factors that contributed to me getting shocked and how this could have been avoided. First off, the room that I was working in had completely dedicated circuits. So I really should have done my research and made sure to turn off every single circuit that was in the box. Using my tick tracer, I was aware that other circuits in that box were alive, but I made the assumption that whoever made them up twisted their wire nuts on nice and tight. While it's true that this could have been avoided had the person that originally made up the circuit did a tug test on each of the wires after they twisted on the wire nut to ensure a good and solid connection, it's still ultimately my fault, first for assuming that whoever made it up made a good tight connection on that wire nut, and also it's my fault for working in a box that had other live circuits. Now, believe it or not, and I have no reason to lie about this because I'm already making an entire video exposing my biggest mistakes and making myself look like an idiot, this is actually the only time in my entire career, which at this point is over 6 years in the trade, that I've ever been shocked by 120. And I've done lots of sustaining and service type work over my career where I've ran into some crazy situations and seen some pretty sketchy things. The thing is, I just always try to work de-energized when I can and take any necessary precautions to mitigate any risks of me getting shocked. Now, before I tell you about more mistakes that I made as an apprentice, I want to take a minute and tell you about the sponsor of today's video, Visor. If you're a contractor, Visor is a job management platform that can really help you take your business to new heights. Rather than using different pieces of software to manage different aspects of your business, Visor allows you to completely manage your business all from one place. Through just a few clicks, you can easily do things like put together professional looking estimates to send to your customers. You can then easily assign jobs to your crew and get them on the schedule. Visor will even help you plan out your day by planning your routes, so that way you can run your business at peak efficiency. While your customers will see a phone number, crew members can easily communicate to your customers directly through the Visor app, which can really streamline all communication between your company and the customer. Invoicing, payment processing, customer history, work orders, and so much more can all be done through Visor's easy-to-use software. All in all, Visor can help you get paid faster, complete more jobs, and keep things running smoothly. You can use the link in the video description to start your free 14-day trial today with no credit card required and no strings attached. And if you use the code MAD at checkout, you can get 15% off of either monthly or annual subscriptions. All right, so the next mistake that I made happened at a time when we had a major shutdown at a hospital. Without getting too into the weeds, basically there had been a catastrophic failure in one of the automatic transfer switches of the hospital that led to a bit of an internal explosion. To be clear, this ATS was a pre-existing piece of gear that was already at the hospital, and it wasn't something that was installed by us. Now, because of the sudden catastrophic failure, we had to do some very important and highly involved emergency shutdowns to refeed power to bypass the failed ATS and get the power off of the emergency generators. I've been a part of some crazy shutdowns at different hospitals, but this one in particular was probably the most important and most impactful. Now, as shutdowns typically go, this was scheduled to take place in the middle of the night. And if I remember correctly, we needed to meet at the hospital at exactly 1:35 a.m. So that way we could grab our cart with everything on it that we needed and start the shutdown at exactly 1:45 a.m. This particular shutdown was going to be done by myself, my foreman, and my general foreman. So it was absolutely critical that every single one of us were there and there on time to start the shutdown. Of course, knowing that I was going to need to wake up at pretty much the middle of the night, I made sure to go to bed extra early that night and set multiple alarms on my phone. That way I made sure that I was definitely going to wake up on time. You may already be able to guess where I'm going with this, and honestly, to this day, I'm not entirely sure exactly how this happened, but I ended up somehow sleeping through my alarms. Knowing that I was only going to be getting a few hours of sleep that night, I remember waking up in the middle of the night and feeling a lot more well rested than I should have, which caused me to panic a little bit and grab my phone and check and see what time it was. The time was almost exactly 1 a.m., which meant that I had only 35 minutes to be at the hospital, which at the time was at least a 40-minute drive from my house. Basically, in complete panic, I had to get ready for work faster that day than I ever had in my entire life, and going to work, I just had to hope and pray that I can make it there in one piece. On my way, I called to explain myself and let him know that while I was going to be there soon, I was not going to be there on time. Now, somehow I did end up getting there almost right on time for the shutdown to actually start, but in the process, this caused a huge amount of unnecessary stress for myself, for my foreman, my general foreman, and ultimately the hospital that was relying on us to get this done. Like I said, this is one of the most important shutdowns that I've ever been involved with in my entire career, and of course it was this shutdown that this happened. Now, what most likely ended up happening here that caused this is that when these alarms went off, I was probably just half asleep and meant to snooze them and accidentally ended up just shutting them off in the process. So here's what I do now every single morning, whether I have an early morning shutdown or just a normal day at work, is I set 3 alarms on my personal phone and I have that phone on my nightstand. And I can snooze through those alarms if I want because I enjoy easing into waking up. But what I also do is I take my work phone and I set an alarm on that goes off when I absolutely need to wake up, and I have that phone in the bathroom. So while I still get to snooze every morning, which I'm sure my wife loves, and I get to ease into waking up, I'm pretty much forced to get up when that last alarm goes off on my work phone because I have to actually get out of bed and go into the bathroom to turn it off. Of course, when this last alarm goes off in the morning, it still allows me enough time to get completely ready for work without being rushed, make it out the door, and make it to work on time. And you guys may think I'm crazy, but when I say get to work on time, what I actually mean by that is that I try to get to work every single day 30 minutes early. I just really hate the feeling and unnecessary stress that's caused by running late to work. So what I do is when I get to work, I actually set another alarm on my phone and I take a 20-minute nap in my car every single day. So on those mornings where there's something unexpected that happens, like a car accident or some construction that I was unaware of, I still always make it to work on time. And when there isn't something unexpected, again, I get to take my 20-minute nap every morning, which I've really grown to love. All right, so this next mistake that I'm gonna tell you about really could have ended up being a lot worse than it was. I'll keep this story a little bit shorter since I know this video is already running a little bit long, but basically I was in a situation where I was on the 2nd floor of a building and there was already a pre-existing hole in the floor. Basically what I had to do was put a hole in the ceiling of the 1st floor that was going to be directly below the hole that was already in the floor of the 2nd floor. So at the time, what seemed like a good idea was to take a small piece of all thread and to push it through the hole that was already existing in the 2nd floor and push it all the way down until it poked a small hole in the ceiling of the 1st floor that I could then use as a pilot hole and take a hole saw and bore out to the size that I needed it to be. As you may be able to guess, what ended up happening was as I was going to make this pilot hole, I somehow ended up losing grip of the rod and it fell straight through the floor and went also straight through the hardwood ceiling of the 1st floor directly below. Now, while this small piece of all thread did go through the hardwood of the 1st floor, what ended up happening was it landed on top of a whole bunch of boxes that were stacked up in that same spot that went almost all the way up to the ceiling. So the small piece of all thread never actually made it all the way to the floor. Now, one of the really unfortunate things about the situation is that while we were smart enough to make sure that nobody was in this room before we attempted to do this, we didn't have somebody stand guard and stay down on the 1st floor, or we didn't put up caution tape or anything. letting people know that there was potentially going to be something that was going to be poking through the ceiling. And wouldn't you guess it, exactly at the time that this happened, somebody ended up walking into this room and seeing the whole thing happen. You can imagine the heart-stopping, stomach-sinking feeling that my coworker and I experienced when we saw the rod slip out of my hand and go straight through the floor. And you can also imagine how much more amplified that feeling was when I went down to the first floor to see exactly what happened and to see that there was somebody there looking at the rod that went through the ceiling and that they were just confused, wondering what had happened. Thankfully, nobody got hurt in the situation, and we did get to walk away from this a little bit wiser. So aside from being a complete klutz and accidentally losing grip of this small piece of all thread, here's what we did right in the situation, and here's what we did wrong. We did do our research before we poked the hole through the ceiling, so we did know pretty much exactly where this was going to be coming through. We knew that it was going to be above the boxes that were stacked almost all the way up to the ceiling, and we also knew that this was going to be right up against the wall, so there was really no chance in our minds that anybody could be under it where they could potentially get hit by it when it fell. We also were smart enough to check the room for vacancy before we poked the hole through the ceiling, but like I mentioned, we were not smart enough to have one of us stay down there to stand guard or to put something up to guard off the room from anybody walking in. Aside from taking that precaution, which in hindsight is painfully obvious that we should have done that, something else that we should have done is maybe bent the rod in a way that would have prevented it from falling through the floor had I accidentally lost grip of it. Also, if you work in the trades, you know that typically around holiday weekends, there's a lot of mistakes that happen, and it's often when people get hurt because people are thinking about taking vacations and having time off and being with their family. And this ended up actually happening right in between Christmas and New Year's Eve when we were only back at work for a few days. So yeah. Now, while part of me wishes that nobody would ever need to hear about these mistakes and that I could just completely forget about them and pretend like they never happened, I am a better electrician today because of them, or at least because of the lessons that I learned from them. And I really hope that in sharing these with you today, that you can also learn from these mistakes and not make them yourself. I think that if we're open and honest about our mistakes, everybody stands to benefit from the lessons that I learned. So for the sake of myself and for the sake of everybody else that's watching this video, if you have any mistakes that you are comfortable sharing that you have made in the past, that you've learned lessons from, would you go ahead and just take a couple of minutes and type those out in the comments down below, so that way we can all, like I said, learn from each other's mistakes. The reality is that even after you complete your electrician apprenticeship, you are still going to make the occasional mistake. But the important thing is that you own up to them when you make them, and ultimately that you can learn from them. Make sure that you like this video if you've enjoyed it, and that you're also subscribed to my channel with a notification bell turned on if you think that you can benefit from seeing more content like this from me in the future. Again, thank you to Visor for sponsoring today's video. Make sure to check them out by clicking on their link in the description, and also check out the other links that I have in the video description too, as I think that you may really be able to benefit from them. Thank you so much for watching, and have a good one.